Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the obstacles often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, Noémi Ványi, senior software engineer at Zeta, joins us to talk about balancing pragmatism and maintainability, leading large-scale system overhauls, and working with legacy code. We also explore lessons from open source maintenance and how to develop the intuition for when a refactor is truly worth it. Noémi joins us from Budapest, Hungary. Noémi Ványi, welcome to Maintainable.
Thank you for having me.
So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
As a software engineer, I think the obvious characteristics are clear decoupled modules, so I don't have to rewrite the whole code base when I want to add a simple feature. Good tests, so it gives me the confidence to change the code, and observability to help me track down bugs and issues. But as you might know, software is not maintained only by software engineers, it's a team effort.
That's true. And one of the things in preparing for our conversation, you kind of have this perspective of, say, open source type projects versus, say, company-driven products. So based on your experience, do you think that maintainability in those different contexts is quite different, or is there actually a lot more overlap?
It's tricky. I developed or still develop software both in open source, but I also worked on closed source software. And the trick is to have either good communication and collaboration with your users. If you are in an open source environment, you can interact with them directly. But if you are working on closed source software, you need to have a good relationship and open communication with product management and support engineers and QA engineers as well, because they can show you where the issues are in your code base or what features you need to prepare for, what is the next step for the software.
What do you think are some key traits to make it, let's say you touched on say communication and expectation there in a closed source type of project within an organization. Your users might be your coworkers or maybe your company's customers. And in open source, your users might just be the other developers that are contributing it, or maybe they're using it within their organizations or for projects that they're working a part of. Do you find that the types of conversations you might have with those different types of people be quite a bit differently because they have completely different organizations you're trying to use that open source project in, or do you still see that there's quite a bit of some consistency there?
I think these are very consistent. There are lots of overlaps between the two conversations. Like a product manager just can easily describe what a user wants, or sometimes even better, because they know what questions to ask users and how to exactly figure out what the requirements are. And sometimes users just come with their problem and leave you hanging. There were many times when a user showed up on GitHub, opened an issue with a short complaint, and I got back to them, asked them how to reproduce this issue, but never got an answer. You probably know this scenario very well.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. And I can't reproduce this, and are you still out there? Do you still need this fixed or not? I appreciate that people will file bugs, or maybe that's just on me as an open source maintainer that I can be a little too slow sometimes to reply to people, but it's open source. How do you think about, let's say, things like documentation and dependency management in those two contexts? Do you feel like that's quite a bit different?
Well, in closed source projects or in companies, I had the luck to work with people who wrote excellent documentation for the software I developed. But obviously, I still had to collaborate with them and write an initial draft and exactly detail how that specific piece of software works. But I had a person who helped me edit those functionality and description for me. In open source, it's a bit trickier because you have to write it for yourself and your future self as well, because you never know if someone else will come and read what you wrote.
That's true. One of the things I wanted to talk with you about is preparing for our conversation. You kind of had a thought, mentioned that maybe not every piece of, say, technical debt is worth paying down, and that even, say, messy looking systems need to be refactored all the time. So how do you decide when something truly needs to be, say, refactored or rewritten, or some of that technical debt get paid down?
So first, I would like to say that obviously as an engineer, my goal is to have the cleanest code possible, but I know that our time is limited and efforts are limited. So that's why I think it's important to kind of evaluate what technical debt is worth paying down. And what I usually pay attention to is if that piece of code or functionality is something that people usually interact with or is kind of changing, or it must be configured differently in the future. And I can only learn that by either talking to product managers, support engineers, or directly to users, because I can kind of gather a sense of what they expect from the future feature and what I can expect from the future.
And do you think that, when you're kind of navigating that to help you weigh up those decisions, does it always seem very obvious that something should be taken care of, or is usually kind of like a fuzzy, maybe if this happens, we might need to come back to this, or?
It can be fuzzy. Like I distinctly remember this scenario from my first job where I was an intern. There was the tech lead of the team and he always knew what to do next. And I was just standing there like, how do you know all these things and how can you see in the future? But after 10 years in the industry, I feel like I also developed this sort of intuition by working with code and code bases and following the industry, and especially the domain where I work at the moment. It is important to follow the news and follow the competitors, not necessarily to copy what they do, but just to see what problems they are solving and how they are solving. And in a way, I can build a, database or pattern database in my brain and try to figure out what part of the code base is likely to change or what features I can expect.
You mentioned, say, you've developed this intuition over the last 10 years or plus in the industry. How much do you think of that has been driven from the people that you're working and co-working with? You mentioned like maybe the lead developer when you were an intern there, and then maybe you've had some mentors along the way, or how much of that do you feel like is just you having to deal with your own past decisions or decisions by other developers of projects that you're working on, later, and you're like, oh, well, now that I understand why they did it this way, but now we have to maybe revisit it this way. Intuition seems like a really difficult thing to train someone on very specifically. So I'm thinking, like, how do you feel like that intuition developed for you? Or was it keeping up with what competitors are doing or what the industry is kind of talking about?
I think intuition is basically a pattern database. You can accumulate patterns by looking at, technical blogs from other companies in the same field. Or what I always tell people is to go on GitHub, look at open source projects, actually look at the code, read through the issues, pull requests. These are very valuable. I usually prefer to learn from other people's mistakes and journeys and so on. So I am somewhat more prepared for anything that comes up in my life. And also, like, as you mentioned, I also learned from my colleagues as well. Basically, I always try to find those people who can be like role models, who I think are excellent engineers. I usually read their pull requests, their issues, everything just silently in the background, just to develop this intuition further.
One of the toughest parts of working with a team is staying organized, especially when you're all sharing the same inbox. That's where today's sponsor comes in. Jelly is the best way for a team to share an email inbox. Whether it's for customer support, community organizing, or even managing banned emails, Jelly helps your team work together better without the hefty price tag of other tools. With Jelly, your team can collaborate on conversations with customers, users, and community members all in one place. No more stepping on toes or sending double replies. The I got this feature makes it clear who's taking the lead. And private inline comments and @ mentions let the whole team contribute when necessary. You can even start conversations directly in Jelly, so everyone stays in the loop from the start. And here's the best part. Jelly's affordable plans are priced per team, not per seat. That means no extra cost as your team grows. Jelly gives you everything you need in a shared inbox. Without the clutter, you don't. Maintainable listeners get 20% off your first year. Find out more at letsjelly.com/maintainable. That's LETSJELLY.com/maintainable. Try Jelly today, the shared inbox your team deserves. All right, let's get back to the show. Do you feel like there's for those listening, like maybe advice, do you think how important is it to understand, say, the software programming language and the frameworks that you might be working within in your organization versus the domain knowledge about the organization's business itself at a kind of like a higher level? And how much do you think that domain knowledge is important around the business part versus focusing a little bit more specifically on the code itself?
Oh, I think the domain knowledge is be like, 70% of the trick to writing maintainable and good code, because there are obviously languages, Rust or C++, that are hard to learn, but usually I don't think that the programming language is the obstacle to writing maintainable code.
Now, I know that you've worked on some significant refactors where a system, say, had to be redesigned piece by piece. So what if some of the biggest takeaways from tackling those sort of large scale overhauls?
As I mentioned in the introduction, one of the things I think is important is clear and distinct modules. For example, one of my stories is that when I worked at Elastic, I used to be part of the team that maintained FileBeat, and it had a input called log input that was responsible for reading files from the disk and sending it to either to Logstash and Elasticsearch. And this log input used to be Logstash forwarder that we kind of inherited and got integrated into FileBeat. But it was just an experimental project. So we had to kind of make it work for more use cases because it worked for most of the use cases. And you would think to yourself, like, reading files, how hard can it be? Can be hard. Right. And there we had issues because that code was very tightly coupled and we could not really extend it. It was not flexible enough. For example, one of the problems we had is how do you identify a file? So, when you rename a file, inode doesn't change, so it can still be the same file if you are reading it because the contents are not changed. You cannot restart it because you would duplicate the log messages from that file. And in that initial version, we only had one way to identify a file, but we needed different approaches. For example, we wanted to be able to support distinguishing files between if they have different names or different inodes, or with some fingerprinting, we could even want it to distinguish files if their contents are changed. But at the time, that was not possible. What we did is we defined clear functionalities and clear components in that input. It was kind of straightforward. It had to be able to find files on the disk, and it had to be able to actually read the contents from disk, and it had to be able to save the position it last read because, the log collection might stop and FileBeat had to know where to continue when it restarted. And what we did is just created these modules, and first we moved out this legacy code and tried to decouple it as much as possible. And then we had the opportunity to actually refactor the code and add extra functionality.
As you went through that process, and out of curiosity, what sort of a programming language was that you were focusing on there?
We worked in Golang or with Golang.
All right, nice. And so as you were kind of going through that process of refactoring, and then were there any other sorts of challenges that came up along the way with performance type issues? How did you think about just navigate through that process? And then you were trying to extend the functionality, it sounded like, right? And so for different use cases, and it sounds like you were able to get there over time. Do you feel like there was some things that earlier on in the process of when that functionality had been originally developed, do you think there was some short-sightedness, or was it that, do you feel like, I wish we would have done this from the start, or do you feel like that was a natural progression, that's what needed to happen, and that's what you would probably kind of follow again in the future? Because you don't want to assume you can do everything probably up front. And so there's that optimization too soon versus dealing with it later.
I think that was the right path for this project because, as I mentioned, it was just a experimental thing. So, the author couldn't have known that this thing will be integrated into something else. And at the time, I believe the author did his best or her best. And also, as we were working with this input, we also ourselves discovered new features that we need to implement by interacting with the users, by learning about their use cases. Because sometimes users can use your software in surprising ways.
Do you ever feel like when you're working on projects like that, people might be using the project, but then they're trying to do something with it that was maybe never intended to be the way that it was done, that it makes sense to try to make that work versus suggest maybe there's a different tool out there? Or do you feel like that's just, I don't know if that particular project was that Elastic that you said? So was that a product that you were able to sell? And so we got to make the product evolve a little bit versus find a different tool that might solve their problem already? Or
Yes, yeah, but it's tricky. I usually felt that users were using the software for the right things, but we just did not anticipate this use case because there are lots of environments, lots of use cases, software is now being used everywhere, basically. One of the challenges we had with reading log files from the disk is that disk might be on a network share that get disconnected, but that's not what we intended FileBit to be used. It would have been just running on your machine and read the local files.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. It sounds challenging. So another, one of the things I also wanted to dig into is I know that you've worked on some legacy projects over the years as well. And so when you've worked on projects where dependencies, say, on those projects hadn't been updated in years, and so sometimes it's turning those small upgrades into, say, major refactorings. How do you approach modernizing a system in that situation?
It's also a tricky question. In my past experience, when I worked with such, it was just a tiny tool that I encountered. Fortunately, it was just a tiny tool. So I just basically looked at the code and rewrote in my preferred language. That was, I think, Python at the time. And that was, for me, it was easy to solve.
Do you think that's always a wise choice to go down that path? Or do you feel like it needs to be a small enough project to, all right, we'll just rewrite this in a different programming language?
I made that decision because that was only a tiny project that I wanted to use. But in a professional setting, I don't think that is doable. You need to do the actual updates and not rewrite the whole tool from scratch.
Do you get a sense that there's projects that you've been a part of that have been neglected from, say, maybe dependencies because there's kind of an assumption on the team that at some point we're going to come back and probably rewrite this at some point, so let's not spend too much time on it. But you're also then tasked with keeping it updated to deal with user requests or bug fixes and stuff like that. So have you found yourself in those types of situations where kind of saying one thing, but we're still taking care of this thing and I don't know when the rewrite's ever going to happen?
Oh, yes, yeah. The problem there usually, I think, or the challenge I faced that I had to kind of get buy-in from other stakeholders to really go through with that refactoring or rewrite. And that was I think the most challenging part of every refactoring, to actually convince managers, fellow engineers that what you want to do, what you want to refactor is really worth the effort.
It is a challenging thing. Have you had much success there or developed some better intuition on how to approach those conversations now than you might have earlier on in your career?
I think yes. My go-to method is to try to show, for example, maybe product manager or fellow engineers that if we do this specific refactoring, we can also add these functionalities that people have been asking for. Because obviously I am not suggesting refactorings just because I look at the code and believe that function is ugly and should be changed to, something else, or it should use a different function from the standard library. So I usually have a business need behind that refactoring because I believe that maintainable software is a business requirement. That's how you can keep up with the industry or even innovate, because the piece of software you work on is easy to extend.
Do you think that developers do a good job, from your experience, like people you worked with or whatever, just in general, struggle with that part of the thing? Because I talked with a lot of product owners or people that are not coders that work on the projects or work part of the thing. And there, when you start out a project, you understand that there's like a MVP experimental type phase of a project. And like, let's try this thing out. And then, oh, great, users are using it, or we're able to sell this, or putting this in production somewhere. And there's some iteration on it. And then a couple of years later, everybody's like, there's a bunch of technical debt. And then the product owners sometimes are like, but we didn't ask. Like the developers can have stories about, we had to cut some corners to get some things done, and we wanted to ship this out, or we should come back and revisit this at some point, and then that never happens. Developers come and go on projects as well. And so there's this kind of like slowly accumulating mess in the code base a little bit, but it's not. But sometimes the product owner is like, well, we didn't ask you to cut corners. You didn't tell us that. If we gave us one more week to do this, we would have kept this more maintainable. So where do you feel like that disconnect starts to grow? Do you feel like it's just the pressure from the product side, or developers being like, we underestimated this and maybe we'll come back at some point? Then they feel like, oh, now I have to convince someone to give us approval to do a refactor or a rewrite or something.
What I've seen so far, or at least in what I usually do, is someone asks me to just do this one thing, and I feel like I know how to add this quickly, and I want to make the other person happy and just quickly add it to the code base, and we move on, everyone's happy. I was useful that day, and the other person got something from me. But yeah, like after a while you start to feel that this part of the code starts to hard to maintain, or maybe someone reports that it does not perform as well as it used to. And I don't think that is necessarily a problem. I mean, this approach, obviously performance issues are a problem, but it is a way to gather domain knowledge and get to know the use cases. It's just, you always have to make time to clean up, because that's how life is. To me, sometimes a code base is like a garden that if you don't tend to it, weed starts to grow.
We'll be back with our interview with Noémi in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I want to take a quick moment to say thank you for making time to listen to the podcast. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and or writing a review on Apple Podcasts to help spread the word. Also, do you know someone in our industry who I should be speaking with on Maintainable? Shoot me an email to robby@maintainable.fm. And now, back to our interview, Noémi, Ványi. You touched on a good point there, like there's those like, hey, I have a small request. Can you quickly do this thing? And then we do it. And those smaller little changes, updates, they feel rewarding in the moment, right? And so it's like, great, I did something. I created some magic. I solved the problem. I'm a problem solver. Excellent. Versus larger projects that you're working on, or that might take weeks or months to ship out, and everybody gets a little frustrated that it's taking too long, and like it's just, there's a lot of coordinating. But when you get those quick little wins, it's easy to kind of like, oh, I want that again. It's like a little shot of endorphins, and you're like, yes. And then later we're like, why did we do that?
Yes, exactly.
I don't know. I think it's like most things, it's probably on a depends. You need to find a right balance there. And I think you mentioned like having time for cleanup. Do you think it's developers put too much emphasis on needing to ask for time to clean up, versus just saying like, yes, we're going to do this and we are going to spend time cleaning up, or this needs to happen? And do you feel like that's a confidence thing, that it takes a while for developers to build that skill up, to be like, this is what we do, not I'm asking for permission, like this is what I'm responsible for, so I'm going to go take care of this? Do you feel like that conversation, have you switched your narrative over the years or found yourself to be a little bit more like that over the years, or have you always been that? I might be making an assumption there just from me.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I've always considered, maybe because I've always, or not always, but most of my career I worked with, like legacy is such a bad word for it. Older code bases.
Software that makes money.
Yes, exactly. So whenever I start planning a feature or a fix, like I always look at it that some part of that work will be refactoring existing code, because I have to kind of lay the foundation for that new thing I want to add to the code base. So like whenever I present these things to, I don't know, stakeholders or other engineers, it feels like it goes without saying that this work will include some refactoring as well. Or like when I even work on a feature, like I know that I submit a pull request, it gets merged, but maybe the next day or a few days later, I realize that I want to refactor this. So I change my code that I wrote like a few days before.
Another thing you mentioned was talking a little bit about when you're working on, say, legacy projects and you're looking at the history of why, or trying to understand why things are the way they are, and seeing maybe old Git commit messages, or assuming you're using Git there, but old pull requests, maybe not always providing enough context. Is that something you've had a lot of experience with, and has it shaped how you think about your approach to commit messages and PRs, templates, and things like that?
Oh, yes. A few years ago, I somehow encountered a very odd error message, and I started to look it up, and I've seen that it is an error. I don't know what repo it was in, but that specific issue was open, and the maintainer of that project submitted a pull request without any comments, and I was like, that's not what you do, and I have no idea why that fixes the problem and how can I fix the problem for my case. And that really showed me that you need to always provide context for what you do. And even I believe it's very important to provide even more context than you believe, or like you usually believe that the other person knows what you know, but that's never the case. So you always have to communicate clearly and exactly what you think, what you're considering, and why you made your decision. And you can never think that the other person knows exactly what you know, because that's false.
I agree with that. Have you been part of conversations or transitional periods where your team were trying to, say, develop better habits together, or been part of like advocating for like, hey, everybody, I kind of think we could do a little bit better with commit messages or our PR templates? Or have you been involved in those types of conversations, or how to like help drive better habits as a team?
Yes, I remember a few years back. I don't know when it was introduced on GitHub, but you could start to have these pull requests and issue templates. That was something we started to leverage both at the company where I worked at the time, but I also added it to my open source projects because it gave us a nice framework, and we can ask, for example, users to provide exact steps to reproduce issues, share logs, and share relevant information with us without going back and forth with them, 4 times, or losing them in the process. And also in pull request, it was very useful because we obviously provided an outline, but in my opinion, most useful thing was that we came up with a checklist for the pull request. Like, did you add tests? Did you add comments? Did you add documentation? Did you update the generated files? And these things, those were so helpful. Like, checklists are super helpful.
Do you think that, when it comes to like, especially with an internal team, I see how that stuff can be really beneficial as well. But in open source projects, I work on an open source project I'm a maintainer of, and we get a lot of issues that get submitted. And I remember at one point when we were deciding to use an issue template or a PR template, but it was specifically around issue templates. I remember thinking, I wonder if this will be a barrier for some people to submit something because there's just too much work for them to even submit the thing in the first place. And I don't know if that was something I was looking, that wasn't necessarily my goal, but it felt like, I'm like, maybe this will like ask people to do a little bit more, since I'm doing this as a volunteer project. That, I don't have forever to actually say, go back and forth, like, hey, can you provide some logs? Can you provide a little bit more details? You mentioned that example earlier where someone raised an issue and then you're like, can you provide the steps to reproduce it, and then they never reply, and then you're like, do I keep this issue open or should we just close it? So like having that process, do you feel like that's a good barrier for people to contribute, or is it maybe kind of depend on the type of project it is?
I think it's a good not necessarily say barrier, because on this specific thing, you can just go ahead and delete this template and still write whatever you want. But I think it could be rather a good, guardrail or something that can help the person who is opening that issue or pull request. And this can be a positive thing. And I hope that if someone is not willing to go through and provide all of this information that is being asked, that their problem is probably not as important.
Just thinking through that process, all of a sudden I had this little moment of wondering, I'm like, I wonder how long it's going to be before, say, GitHub Issues is a little bit more interactive with maybe some, I'm air quoting, AI functionalities. Like, hey, how did you submit your issue? It replies, like, what were the steps to reproduce this? And like, can you provide some more context before the developers look at it? I could see how that could potentially be a way that those tools evolve. Because I don't know if as a developer myself, when I'm looking at an open source project that I'm having an issue with, it's like, do I have time I'm like searching for an issue because I'm seeing some weird error message and I'm searching on the internet to see if I can find something. I find a library that people have mentioned a similar thing. And I'm like, do I open up a new issue or someone has already brought this one up? And like, I'll have to come back to this later because I'll just move on from now and I can work around it. And so I'm always just thinking about how to make that easy for people, but also knowing that I might not have time to fill the issue out, or I might not have time to actually then follow up in the future and be that person that submitted something and then the issue just gets lost in the ether for a while. And then like in 2 months when they reply to me, I'm like, I don't remember what that was about. So it's an interesting challenge for open source community projects.
Yes. But if you forget something, maybe it wasn't important in the first place.
Yeah, that's true. You should set up a rule of like, I don't follow up on my own issues that I've opened up in 2 months. Just go ahead and delete it. It's fine. Or maybe someone else will have a similar issue. But the topic I want to talk about is developer autonomy. Because it's not just about the code. It's also about how developers work. We talked a little bit about habits and how teams can create an environment where developers feel empowered to improve the code base. Do you have for those listening, maybe some advice if they don't feel like they have a lot of autonomy at the moment because they're just like, say, part of a team where tickets get assigned to them, or like, sure, I'll work on that, but like taking care of, say, technical debt isn't seen as a priority right now, but developers are like, I feel like we need to be working on this stuff as well, but they're not sure how to ask for time or to be an advocate for themselves.
It's a hard question. I must say that I've been very lucky during my career so far because I always got to be very independent and I could always make decisions for myself. Obviously, because I was trusted that I am making the right decisions for the team and for the company. But what I think could help others is that they have to think from the product perspective and think from the company's perspective and take on problems that benefit the team and the product, the company, because that's the common goal and everyone's goal at that place. Yeah, but I think if you can frame these things, communicate in a way that how the specific refactoring or feature or anything they want to implement can help the company grow or help the team become more efficient, they will find supporters very quickly. Or not necessarily quickly. The other important thing that, I've learned this through experience, that you have to keep repeating yourself. You have to pitch the same idea over and over again, even to the same people, because everyone has their own problems, own context, and you have to be patient, and fight is not the right word, but you have to persist.
Hey folks, it's Robby here. I want to take a moment to tell you about my company, Planet Argon. Think of us as expert gardeners for your software projects, helping legacy applications grow, thrive, and bloom into something beautiful. Need to clear out some weeds? We offer staff augmentation to help tidy up your code base. Looking to plant something new? Our fractional development services ensure that your software gets just the right amount of care without overwatering your team. We specialize in technologies like Ruby on Rails, React, and Laravel. So if you know of a company whose software feels overgrown with technical debt or is struggling to take root with new features, send them our way. We'll prune, nurture, and cultivate it into something strong, healthy, and built to last. Visit us at planetargon.com. That's planetargon.com. All right, let's get back to the show. And remember, great software, like a great garden, needs regular care to flourish. Yeah, I get that. And I work in consulting, and so we'll get brought into different engineering teams that are struggling, and we'll have one-on-one conversations with developers there. And like, well, I feel like I brought this up several times, but I've heard no, not right now a few too many times. And so I've stopped asking because it doesn't seem to be a priority for them. So then they stop asking in general. And then I'm like, well, is that going to get you to where you wanted to be? And like, well, I feel like I'm not getting anywhere with that. Or I've already said it a few times. And you said you have to keep repeating it. At what point do you recommend developers just start doing some of it and then maybe ask for forgiveness later if necessary?
I would say that if you can still do what you are expected and get away with it, doing it in the background, then you can do it anytime. You don't have to ask for permission for everything. I assume you can take an hour off, maybe a day, and try to improve the code base or do the things that you believe that improve the processes for your team and for the company.
I will always follow up with those developers. I'm like, so tell me what you think, say, a product owner does with their time. Do you think everything that they work on has been put into a Kanban board and it's just organized in that fashion? That's the only thing they're working on? Or if their fancy spreadsheets get a little messy, do you think they ask for permission to just refactor their spreadsheets? We have to do the things that we need to do to improve our workspace, and clean our desks. Do you need to ask for permission to clean your desk off? Like, you just do it, right? And so it's just, I think that sometimes developers fall into the trap because it's this request from them, and we give them some code back or some solution back, that there's this exchange transactionally every time. That I'm like, yeah, but you're also just responsible for your workspace, and your workspace includes the code base. Like, that's where you work all day. And so clean it. Like, that's your desk, in a way. I mean, maybe.
Yes, yeah, it's an excellent metaphor, yeah.
Do you have any, as you're evolving in your career, are there things that you wish you had been able to tell yourself earlier that you would recommend to anyone? Like, just like, I don't know what the answer for that is, but is there things you wish you would have learned earlier on?
Maybe this one, that if you have an idea, say it to people and don't be afraid to repeat yourself. And even if you say your idea first and no one responds, it doesn't mean that your idea is bad. It just means that you either have to pitch it once more, or you have to come up with, I don't know, a proof of concept or something more tangible that people can understand better or interact with it. So it's just, don't give up on your ideas.
Have you, one thing I think about with people that are kind of new to a company, so you join an existing code base at a new organization, and there's that early period on when you're there and you're learning the domain and like how the team works together, how the project works, and making sense of it, and you start having curiosities like, I wonder why they made these decisions. How long do you tend to think that people should wait before they start asking maybe stupid questions, air quoting stupid questions, or questioning past decisions? Like, do you think you should do that really quickly, or do you feel like you should kind of wait a little bit before you do that?
Oh, I think you should ask questions right away. Like, why wait?
Have you ever been in a scenario where you might have asked a question or proposed something, and then you've heard, not necessarily not right now, but, oh, we already tried that and it didn't work. I think we did something like that 3 years ago and it didn't work. And so like, oh, okay. So do you find that that's where you should just drop it? Or do you think that's like, well, maybe things have changed since then, maybe we should reapproach it now?
I think if they say that it was like long time ago in the past, the industry changes very quickly. So there could have been developments that enable this past idea to be implemented in the present. But also, like, there is no problem with suggesting something that they already tried in the past.
All right, before we wrap up, I am curious, is there something that you find to be really useful for yourself that you would recommend that other developers consider doing that would make a real difference in their day-to-day coding life?
I think in your day-to-day, it is very important when you are working with code is to only fix problems that are problems. And, there are problems that you might think that, I don't know, something is not good enough, but no one else has complained or no one else reported this issue before. That is might be because no one is using this part of the code, so it can stay as is. Or I believe that you don't have to fix anything unless it is broken. So don't go ahead and do unnecessary cleanups and refactorings just for the sake of improvement, because that is extra work for your colleagues because they have to review your pull requests. And still you can introduce more bugs by trying to fix something.
Great advice there. And I'm curious, is there a non-software, non-programming book that you find yourself recommending to your peers? And that could be any type of book. Is there a book you'd love to recommend?
Yeah, I read this book years ago, and I find myself recommending it to multiple people. The title is Lost in Thought, The Hidden Pleasures of an Intellectual Life. It was written by a philosopher named, I think, Zena Heights. I am sorry, I don't know how to pronounce her name. And it is very interesting. So it was written by a philosopher, so it's more of a contemplation on how these leisure activities and just learning new things for the sake of learnings can enrich our lives. So it's very different from my day-to-day, where I try to learn things for the business to be a better engineer. It really showed me lots the value of these seemingly useless hobbies.
That's great. I'll definitely include links to that in the show notes. That's Lost in Thought, right?
Yes.
And where can people find you online, or where's the best place people can track you down if they have questions or want to inquire about the projects you're working on?
I am on GitHub, github.com/kvch, and now I have a website, kvch.me.
Okay, excellent. I will definitely include links to both of those in the show notes for everybody. And with that, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Noémi. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Maintainable, a Planet Argon production. Editing by Claudia Armbruster. Post-production by Autumn Morgan and Ellis Svensson. Emotional support from the letter M. For Maintainable, for momentum, for making things better. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Keep showing up. See you next time. Maintainable.